right. Hi, so thanks so much for coming. I didn't expect to be in this very grand environment. Firstly, I want to acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging, emphasising that sovereignty was never ceded and that I'm a non-Indigenous researcher standing on stolen land. For a bit of background about myself, so my name is Ewenson, I'm a social worker and I'm a newcomer to working in the disaster sector, working specifically within a research initiative called HowWeSurvive at UNSW. So HowWeSurvive is specifically focused on enhancing processes of community-centred disaster recovery. Prior to completing my PhD in 2022, I worked for 20 years in a range of legal and social work roles. Today, I'm going to talk about research which combines my focus on the right to adequate housing and as well as enhancing the recognition of social workers in the disaster context. Climate change is increasing the intensity and frequency of extreme weather events around the world, as we've all either witnessed or experienced in recent years, both across Australia and internationally. Australia, already prone to bushfires and floods, is now experiencing more catastrophic events. CSIRO's recent State of the Climate report provides alarming detail about the climate change impacts for our nation. Disasters caused by extreme weather events lay bare the uneven and inequitable landscapes across our country. But social workers play an integral role in all aspects of disaster management in a range of organisations, yet we are frequently under-recognised for our work by others within the disaster sector and also elsewhere. Research in Aotearoa, New Zealand has revealed that across the disaster sector there, social workers are most highly recognised for their work at the micro level, and that there's a limited awareness or understanding of social work engagement at the meso or macro levels. With the very generous collegial support and permission of Kath Hay and Catherine Margaret Pascoe, the Aotearoan researchers, I'm replicating this study which they undertook in New Zealand within the Australian context. And this is going to ascertain disaster professionals' understanding of social workers in this domain and to learn more of social workers' experiences in this context, aiming to strengthen the recognition of the role of social work in this context, and thus with the overall aim of enhancing community outcomes in disaster settings overall. So while I'm waiting for ethical approval to commence this research, which will take place at the beginning of 2025, hopefully, for today's talk, based on an initial review of the literature, it's posited that as social workers in the disaster sector, we could increase our activity at the macro level, this being both critical in of itself for strengthening community outcomes, and this could also enhance a broader understanding and recognition of disaster, of social work within the disaster sector. So as we all know here, social workers engage with individuals, families and communities in ways which challenge top-down military-style approaches that are endemic to and deeply problematic within the disaster sector. Social workers are absolutely integral to promoting individual and community self-determination and strengths-based approaches in the context of disasters. A significant part of social work practice in disaster contexts is concerned with housing and housing recovery. So, as we all know, disasters can damage or completely destroy housing, but it must be remembered that this destruction takes place on top of an already extensive and prolonged housing crisis and the deeply uneven landscape across our nation. For some context about recent disasters in housing, the 2008-2009 Black Saturday bushfires destroyed over 2,000 homes, the Queensland floods in 2010 and 11 damaged 28,000 homes, the Black Summer bushfires in 2019-20 destroyed 2,500 homes, and the recent Northern River floods of 2022 caused 4,055 properties to be deemed uninhabitable, 11,000 properties were assessed as considerably damaged, and over 4,000 people were immediately evacuated away from Lismore, with thousands more people displaced, and many of whom still remain displaced across the region. We all intrinsically know that home is more than where the heart is. Stable, adequate and secure housing, amongst other attributes, provides us with the platform to thrive in all domains of life, including health and of course mental health, relationships, access to education and the ability to hold down a job. The context of climate change accelerated disasters cannot be separated from the pre-existing national housing crisis, and the entire housing ecosystem needs to be reconsidered as embedded within this era of climate change. In the language of international human rights law, the right to adequate housing is described as fundamental, a base from which we can then achieve our other social, economic, cultural and civil rights to which we are all entitled, and recognising the interdependency of these rights is key. So as you would all know, in 1975, Australia ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, within which the right to adequate housing is defined. And you can read that there. So within Australia, there is a widespread housing crisis. Levels of homelessness are at an all-time high. Rising rents and rental insecurity underlie housing precarity. Social and public housing levels are vastly insufficient within some contexts, substandard conditions, and the cost to purchase a home in Australia's major cities has now escalated far beyond the reach of most. Inequalities across the nation are deepening rapidly, significantly driven by this crisis of housing. So as the International Federation of Social Work tells us, we need to transform the political and economic systems away from extractive and exploitative to inclusive and sustainable. And policies and practices at global and local levels must be shaped to halt environmental destruction and to create wellbeing for all people. And as Heather Boetto spoke so beautifully earlier, she reminds us that human rights and environmental issues are inextricably connected, and social work has an absolutely critical role to play in trying to shape a socially and environmentally just world. Disaster justice comprises both social justice and environmental justice, and social work as a human rights-based profession plays an integral role in achieving this goal within this era of climate change. Lalani Farha, a previous UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing, who's still very active in this space, has articulated that homelessness or grossly inadequate housing should be addressed as an unacceptable violation of the right to life. While economic, social and cultural rights have been frequently viewed as the lesser cousin compared to civil and political rights, there is growing recognition that the achievement of economic, social and cultural rights is fundamental for the achievement of a socially just and humane society. Fundamentally, we need to shift our understanding of housing away from commodification and asset development to that of solely providing a home. Governments need to counter the unfettered self-interest that late-stage capitalism promotes, and the housing markets, in all forms and tenure, need to be shaped with the full recognition of the humanity of all. So presented here today is a very provisional framework to develop the housing context in Australia in the context of disasters and beyond, building on the mission-style approach of public intellectual Mariana Mazzucato. So I've developed a 9-point plan, which is for amendment and development. But firstly, Australia needs a Commonwealth Human Rights Act urgently, and this would include fully justiciable economic, social and cultural rights for all individuals. A Commonwealth Human Rights Act would articulate the right to housing, it would provide domestic legal accountability, and interpretation of this right would be guided by commentary of the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Housing, and related jurisprudence. The introduction of such an act would include extensive human rights education to accountable government bodies, including housing authorities, to the judiciary, and to community and advocacy groups, amongst other relevant parties. Notably, other comparable countries have included the right to housing in their national constitution, including Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands. However, as we know, constitutional amendment in Australia is an incredibly difficult task, and the alternative pathway of the introduction of a legislative Commonwealth Human Rights Act would shift Australia to a modern human rights engaged nation. Australia is currently in the very unenviable position of being the only democratic nation in the world to not have a national bill or charter of human rights. Social housing, as we would all know, needs to be dramatically increased. Social housing in Australia comprises Indigenous housing, community housing and public housing, and as of June 2022, there were 418,000 households living in the main social housing programs across Australia. This amounts to less than 4% of our housing stock, as compared to nations such as Austria, the Netherlands and Denmark, where social housing comprises at least 20% of housing stock. So that's a target we should be aiming for, if not higher. Homelessness services need a substantial increase in funding to play a significant part in promoting and protecting the right to adequate housing in a disaster context. Homelessness services need to be able to assist pre-existing homeless populations and those made homeless by disasters through the provision of wraparound services during prolonged periods of disaster recovery and beyond. As the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare described, the numbers of homeless people across Australia is a deep national concern, with Census Night in 2021, which is an old statistic, revealing that there were more than 122,000 people in Australia homeless, but this figure is expected to be considerably underestimated. Recent reports have revealed that the number of people living in precarious situations after disaster for prolonged periods has increased significantly due to the vastly insufficient resourcing of homelessness services. Following the model of nations such as Finland, a zero target for homelessness in Australia is required. Such a target will require requisite resources invested in social housing, as discussed before, and moving away from an over-reliance on short-term emergency accommodation arrangements which do not create a platform for people to thrive. Okay. Habitability, cultural safety and community must be the focus for any emergency or temporary housing provided in disaster context, and this aligns with the right to housing, adequate housing literature and jurisprudence. Temporary housing must take into account the particular context and requirements of those being housed. As has been noted in recent reporting, the temporary housing provided to flood survivors in Lismore has not met these thresholds, and the amount of temporary accommodation provided has also been vastly insufficient. Furthermore, the New South Wales Auditor-General has found that this temporary housing program has not met the needs of mobility impaired people, and cultural safety concerns have been expressed by First Nations people about some of the agencies and organisations involved in facilitating the temporary housing arrangements. Greater rental legislative protections in terms of housing habitability, protection from unreasonable rent increases and protection from forced evictions are required, including for when residing in social housing. Buyout programs, or land buyback or housing buyback programs, have a strong element of collective solidarity in repurposing land no longer suitable for housing because of climate change and disaster risk. However, such buyout programs need to be facilitated in a timely manner with the voluntary opportunity to acquire a similar land holding or home in the region, recognising the importance of place and community in such processes. Such local and timely processes will minimise the risk of social capital disappearing, which happens if communities are rapidly depleted of members and therefore also depleted of associated community spirit. With regards to insurance, recent Commonwealth parliamentary reporting has examined the considerable distress and hardship caused by the current system of private home insurance for those who have experienced disasters across Australia. There's a need for a collective government-owned system of home insurance similar to Medicare and the health system, so people are not penalised, for example, through insurance premiums becoming unmanageably too expensive or homes being deemed uninsurable for those living in areas more prone to climate change exacerbated disasters. Such a model is equitable and socially just, as it is not these individuals who are primarily responsible for the emissions escalating climate change and the resultant destructive impacts, nor of the land use planning failures. The individualised process of home insurance is a maladaptation in this era of the Anthropocene, where private insurance companies, always primarily seeking to make a profit for their shareholders, have inadvertently found themselves at the front line of determining risk from climate change. Instead, this era of climate change calls for a return to the origins of the modern insurance system, that of community members living in solidarity together and helping each other. It is this ethos which needs to be applied by duty bearers, that being governments, to promote the right to adequate housing in a disaster recovery context. And finally, urban and regional planning needs to proceed with climate change and climate change-induced disasters as a key consideration. And social workers must be active contributors within such planning processes. In Sweden, recent legislation mandated that social workers be involved in land use planning processes, recognising their expertise working with marginalised communities and the pertinence of eco-social work theory in our climate-changed world. So, in conclusion, this is a provisional framework for adaptation as required for the context, with policy ideas and levers for advocacy by social workers about the right to adequate housing in this era of climate change. Adequate housing is absolutely fundamental to our overall wellbeing. Social workers are critical to working alongside communities in disaster contexts in long-term roles, and an increase in social work activity at the macro level of practice could contribute to the overall goal of achieving disaster and social justice for communities impacted by disasters going into the future. So, thank you. Thanks.